It's now my honor to bring to the stage Mr. Walt Douglas.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You know, I used to cringe when I was around Coleman because I didn't words like that. I do come from North Carolina by way of D.C. We moved here in 1966 with the Internal Revenue Service when they established an IRS data center here in Detroit. And I was invited to come because I was one of the smartest son of bitches they had in Washington at the time. You know the movie Hidden Figures. Well, those ladies wrote programs. That's what I did. And they needed somebody out here who could write programs also. So I arrived in July of 1966, just a year and 12 days before the civil disturbance in 1967, which nobody in this room knew how much of a change that was going to make to this city. But it did. And some of the things that happened before Coleman became mayor kind of set the stage for what he was putting his foot into. The Bethel incident, you may remember on Linwood at the Bethel AME Church, not AME Church, where a police officer was shot and killed and several were wounded. And the Detroit Police Department locked up 143 people, took them down to the 9th Precinct because they were going to charge them all for this murder, I guess. But Jimmy Del Rio, some of you may remember that name, called Judge George Crockett, who was a brand new Recorder's Court judge. And Judge Crockett went down to the 9th Precinct and released all of those people on a writ of habeas corpus. And I thought the community was going to explode. All of the papers were against what he did. The white community was against what he did. And we were standing and watching and trying to figure out what was going to happen. That was one of the incidents that kind of created what Coleman was stepping into. You remember the Big Four? Yes. 4 police officers with shotguns at the ready would drive around town and leer at people, or just jump out and walk to the corner. We still have some of that today, unfortunately. But that was another kind of an incident. I met Coleman on a Friday night over at the Franklin Wright Settlement Center on the Lower East Side. That was part of his district. And Senator Young would come from Lansing to Detroit and meet with the people over there and tell them, bring them up to date about what was happening in the city. One of the things that was going on at the time was school decentralization. You remember that the school system was decentralized and 8 regional offices were set up. Well, Coleman and Larry Doss had worked on that. Larry was doing the decentralization for the city, and he went to Lansing and worked out the details of that with Coleman. They became friends at that point. So my going over to the Franklin Wright Settlement Center was because I was Larry's new vice president at New Detroit. He had taken over the job after Bill Patrick left to go back. He went back to Michigan Bell and then on to New York. And Larry replaced him. And then Larry hired me in February of 1972 to join him at New Detroit. So this was in the spring of 1972. And at our board meetings, Larry was sounding out our board members, many of whom were white CEOs, about the need for the mayor, for the city of Detroit to have an African-American mayor. They said, no way, the time is not right. You know, the time is never right. But nonetheless, we went on. There was a provision in the state constitution that said if you were an elected official in the state, you could not run for a local office. Well, that meant that if Coleman wanted to run for mayor in 1973, he would have to resign from his state Senate seat. Coleman filed a lawsuit. And he filed it early in the year, but the Supreme Court, the Michigan Supreme Court, did not come down with an answer until June of 1973, 2 months before the primary. Nonetheless, Coleman announced that he was running for mayor. He formed a small group that included Larry, and Larry brought me along. We met in Bob Milner's basement. You remember Bob Milner, the political guru here in the city? Georgia Brown, some of you may remember Georgia Brown, and Joyce. Joyce was there, Joyce Garrett was there as well. And we began to start brainstorming about what to do. Well, one of the things is nobody knew Coleman, especially the white business community. Larry took it upon himself to take Coleman to all of the CEO's offices. He started with Henry Ford II in Dearborn. Then he met with Walker Sisler, who was head of DTE, now DTE Industries, but was Detroit Edison at the time. Ralph McIlvaney at Washington National Gas, the gas company here. Jim Roach, who was the CEO of General Motors. Lynn Townsend, who was head of Chrysler. Ray McDonald, who was head of Bertha. All of these gentlemen were on the board at New Detroit. So Larry introduced Coleman to them. They all contributed modest amounts of money to his campaign. Now, to set the stage, Mel Ravitz, president of the Detroit City Council, was also running. And Commissioner John Nichols was running. You remember the three. Coleman, who had been always close to the UAW, just assumed that he would get some support from them. They made their announcement in July, just weeks from the primary in August, about which candidate they were going to support. We were in Bob Milner's basement, all hoping that the next day we would get some money because the campaign was broke, absolutely broke. Well, the next day, instead of supporting Coleman, they supported Mel Ravitz. And here we were with no money, trying to mount a campaign. Well, Bob Milner put $23,000 of his own money into the campaign. Georgia Brown mortgaged her house and put that money in the campaign. That got us started. But the ace in the hole was Buddy Battles. Buddy Battles was the head of Local 600, the Ford local, the largest local, UAW local in the city. He threw his weight behind Coleman Young. And that, folks, is the rest of the story. He beat Mel Ravitz, and then in November, by a thin margin, beat John Nichols, because the city had a lot of white folks back in those days. But nonetheless, Coleman beat him, and that was the wildest party I've ever seen in my life. Downtown that night in the Hilton Hotel, which has been torn down now, but every room was filled with people having fun. It was a great, great evening. The next day, things got started, and then there was an inaugural in January that year, and Diana Ross came and sang Reach Out and Touch somebody's hand. It was in the old Edsel Ford Auditorium. It's torn down now. A great party. And then Coleman went to work. But during the campaign, he needed some people to help him manage his campaign. So a good friend of mine, and many of you know Bill Beckham, you know Charlie Beckham, his brother. Bill was in Washington working for Senator Hart. And Coleman convinced him to come back and help him with the campaign. And also Malcolm Dade. Some of you know Malcolm Dade. So the two of them joined Coleman, helped him run his campaign, and then after the campaign, became his #1 and #2 guys. There was another interesting guy. During the campaign itself, Bob Pizer, who became his media expert, was working for the Detroit News, and he used to yell at Coleman. He says, "Coleman, you don't keep any appointments you make. You put out of a schedule, and you never show up where you're supposed to be. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to write about it?" Well, that guy fell in love with Coleman and became his press secretary after he was elected mayor. But then Coleman began to put together his cabinet. There was a new city charter that was passed at the same time. The first time the charter had been revised since 1923. And one of the things it did is it strengthened the police department by getting rid of a commissioner and creating a board of police commissioners. And then the chief of police replaced what was then the commissioner. So you now have a chief of police now, and that's where it came from. That charter revision was made at the same time that Coleman was elected mayor. Coleman, talking to Larry, says, "You know, I've got to figure out how to put this commission together, and I need some help." And Larry looked at me. He says, "Well, Walt could probably help you." And so Larry Doss loaned me to the city for 2 years. The city didn't pay me a dime. They gave me a raggedy police car to drive. But I went over to the police department. And you can't imagine what it's like. A kid who had only been in the police department once in his whole life. And that was when they locked me up for speeding one time in North Carolina. I go over to the police department. I walk into Tanya's office, and he's not there, but a guy by the name of Mac Douglas is there. So Mac says, "So who are you? What are you here for?" I said, "Well, the mayor sent me over to help Jerry Tanya reorganize the police department to make it more effective." Okay, that's how it started. I began to meet people, go to lunch with officers. Some of them heard I was there. One by the name of Joe Arita, who was inspector on the east side. He kind of liked Coleman, but there was some other gentlemen there, George Jackson, who was a commander, and George Harge, these are African-American commanders. They had kind of been close to Commissioner Nichols during his campaign. It kind of helped for him. They were secret. They weren't working for Coleman. So they quickly retired. Frank Blunt, some of you know Frank Blunt. You remember him? Boisterous Frank Blunt, great guy. Coleman made him executive deputy. But there was also another executive deputy there, a guy by the name of Tony Bertoni. They couldn't be in the same room at the same time. Jerry Tanya would have a staff meeting. He would invite them in. If one of them was in first, the other wouldn't come in. That was the kind of the way it was. And I'm just standing there watching, just seeing how this place is really not operating too effectively. My job became one of meeting and interviewing viable African-American candidates that could be promoted up through the ranks. And guys like Reginald Turner. Some of you may remember him. George Harville, who was a good friend of Frank Blunt's. These people became Eastern and Western deputy chiefs within the department during Coleman's first venue. Now, the big problem was there were very few officers from which to select to be promoted. And Coleman had heard that federal judge Freeman, Ralph Freeman, a few years earlier had come down with an edict that said, in hiring police, there's been a suit by women in the Detroit area about not being able to be members of the Detroit Police Department. Ralph Freeman came down with an edict that said, for every man that you hire, you must hire a female. That happened before Coleman became mayor. But then, sitting in his office, and we were brainstorming about what to do. He says, well, shit, we can use that. He said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, you got a sergeant's list and an inspector's list. Why don't we just take the two lists and split them in half? Put all the black officers in one list and all the white officers in another list, and we'll just promote one for one from each list. And that's what he did. Well, you can imagine how that affected the DPOA. They went apeshit. They went to federal court and filed a lawsuit. To make a long story short, the lawsuit did come down in favor of Mayor Young. So he did not stop doing that. And that's how you begin to see African-American officers bubbling up within the department. Now, the Board of Police Commissioners itself, it was my job to put it together. There are 5 commissioners, and sitting with Coleman, we decided we would have 3 white and 2 black. Doug Frazier was appointed Alex Ritchie, Ed Lojohn, Susan Mills Peake, and Reverend Coleman's minister at his church, Reverend Dr. Charles Butler. So that was the initial campaign. That was the initial 5 commissioners. We then had to hire a staff. Tony Jones was a writer for the Detroit Free Press. We hired her. She lasted a little while, and then we hired a guy by the name of Paul Dunnigan. But the Board of Police Commissioners became the vehicle through which Coleman implemented all of his programs, including the one with the 2 lists. That came along after the Board of Police Commissioners had been appointed. Things began to change in the police department. You may remember some other things were happening. We had school busing in the city of Detroit at that time. And it was implemented in 1975, and Coleman sent all of us up to Boston to observe what was going on there. You may remember they had a violent school busing situation there, and I and some other officers went up there. Frank Blunt and I were the 2 African-American officers. And Frank, just like the commissioner in the fire department, didn't look like he was really black. So it was me and all these white officers and Frank. Can you imagine a street 2 blocks long with police officers standing shoulder to shoulder all the way down on both sides as the school buses rolled up to bring these young kids from Roxborough to this school in Boston? We were there as observers. This little lady about so high walked up to me, and she looked at me. She formed spit in her mouth, and I stared her down. She didn't do it, but she was about to do it. But that's what it was like there. And everybody thought we were going to have the same kind of situation when we got back here. We had absolutely no incidents when we instituted school busing in 1976 here in the city of Detroit. None. I became a part of Coleman's kitchen cabinet. There were people like Larry and me, Judge Damon Keith, Arthur Johnson, and Max Pincus. Some of you may remember Max Pincus. He ran Hughes Hatcher Suffering. And we'd sit down, and Coleman would throw things out that he wanted to do with us. And we would determine and give him our advice, which he would sometimes take. But most times, he had his mind already made up. He just wanted to bounce the idea off to see what we thought about it. Those early years of the Coleman Young administration, there were some ups and downs. You may remember that there were the rumors that Frank Blunt was on the take. And some thought that Coleman should fire him, but Coleman wouldn't fire him. He put him on executive leave, but he wouldn't fire him. He had a way of figuring out how to resolve problems or how to get around them. The new city charter, for example, had a stipulation that said that your personnel director must have 5 years of experience. Well, there's nobody around that Coleman knew that had 5 years of experience. But what did he do? You all know Denise Lewis. She was head of the Commission on Community Relations under Ray Gribbs. And Coleman kept her when he became mayor. So he decided he would make Denise acting personnel director. So she acted for 5 years. And then she had the experience to be the personnel director. That's the way he got around problems. He just didn't say, okay, I've got to do a national search and find somebody that's got 5 years of experience that I can trust. No, I'm going to do it my way. And that was the way he did it. You may remember that he built the Ellis Arena with nothing, no money, and saved the Detroit Red Wings from moving out of the city because they had already signed a deal with Michigan National Bank to move and build an arena adjacent to the Palace, not the Palace, the old Silverdome. The day that the board was meeting, Larry Dawson and I and Coleman called Al Pelham. Al Pelham, any of you remember Al Pelham? He's an old timer who used to be treasurer in the county. He was on the board of Michigan National Bank. We called him out of the meeting and told him what was happening. Coleman promised to build a Ellis Arena downtown, and he did. And that loan was turned down, and the Red Wings never left the city. So there were a lot of things behind the scenes that Coleman did, not just in the police department, but in every department. And he appointed a mixed cabinet. Mel Jefferson was in the commission of the fire department. Jimmy Watts ran the DPOA, DPW. And that was the way he set up his cabinet. Bob Rosenfeld ran the community development operation. So he said, I'm going to have black and white. It's going to be mixed, but they're going to be my people. Now, the police department, under Coleman Young, in my judgment, reformed itself. I can remember when we sat in his office, and he didn't like Tanya. And he says, well, who am I going to replace him with? I said, well, Bill Hart's a pretty fine officer. He says, well, I hear all these rumors about Bill Hart, that when he was an undercover agent, he used to take bribes and all that kind of thing. The people over at the Drug Administration don't like him. It became my job to go over to the Detroit Drug Enforcement Agency and meet with them and query them whether or not they had anything on Bill Hart. No, we don't have anything on Bill Hart. So I went back to Coleman and said, they say he's clean. Bill Hart then became the first black chief of police in the city of Detroit at that time. That would have been 1975 or 76, something like that. And he served for a while, but we know the rest of the story. But that wasn't Coleman's fault. He gave him the chance, and while he was chief, he did a great job. Bill Hart and I once went to New York to meet with the drug enforcement agencies up there, the NYPD. The way they handled their drug enforcement agencies, they had a lucite safe right in the middle of the squad room. You could see all the drugs and all the money right in there. Nobody could steal it. I thought that was pretty smart. I don't think we did it like that way in Detroit, but that was the way they did it in New York. But my years with Coleman were great years. I learned a lot from him because he was a fearless, take charge, my way or the highway kind of guy. And I still think about him a lot now and credit him was giving me a lot of insights of how to handle political issues. Okay.
I don't know if you've had the opportunity to read the autobiography of Mr. Walt Douglas, but if you have not had that opportunity, I encourage you to do so. You will find it fascinating as well as a great read. Maybe it's in the bookstore here at the museum, probably so.